Hello, it is I, Sad Nixon, and this is a video about my analysis of the draft for the fifth Secret Hitler tournament. And yeah, as promised, I'm going to be looking through the draft and seeing what statistics we can find based on how well each person did. Yeah, recording this from inside of my Nissan Rogue outside. But anyways, first I'd like to say a few things. Number one, I'm not looking at the captains for this video because the captains weren't drafted. Now you could say, the captains were drafted just by the vote of the people, but I don't think that's really the same thing. I don't think when we draft the captains, we pick the people who we think are highest skill. You know what I'm saying? Like, I wouldn't have gotten picked as a captain if people were picking captains for highest skill. That's not what the draft is for, or that's not what the captain's vote is for. So it's not really fair to say, okay, the person who got the most votes for captain should be the most skilled person. I don't think that's right. But the people in the draft, in theory, if you're drafting someone first, they should be the most talented person, or not necessarily the most talented person, but they should be the person who will get the team the most value. Regardless of where you put them in, whether you're putting them in special games or not, if you draft someone first, that should be your top point getter. If all goes well, ideally speaking, that's how a draft should work. So, thinking about that, let's go through the data. Now, number one, I like to talk a little bit about how this data works. So this is a Jupyter notebook. Um, it's just a nice way to do Python coding. All of this is running on data that I put in a spreadsheet myself. It's this spreadsheet, right? So on this spreadsheet, we actually have every single player who got drafted, their draft order. I copied this over manually. Their ELO, I also copied this over manually, and also their points and win rate. And this is actually imported from Secret Accounts spreadsheet that runs the whole tournament. So this I didn't have to copy in manually. I used some Google Sheets magic, but yeah, this is the spreadsheet that I use. This is how I got all this data. But anyways, let's start looking into it. So the first thing that we can look at is we can try to compare the draft order, the order in which they were drafted, and the order in which they ended up in on the ranking of scorers, like basically the MVP leaderboard. So if you got first place in the draft, and you got first place in the MVP leaderboard, then that means that you were drafted correctly, right? You got first place, everything turned out as planned. So if we look at the data sorted by the difference between your points order and your draft order, then we can see how far away were you from what we would expect based on your draft in terms of how you did in points. So we can see, if we sort this way, we can see who had the biggest difference. This is actually showing the people, because it's points order minus draft order here, this is showing the people who are the most underrated by the draft. And we can see up here, we have some familiar names, Sax John and 007 Fashtusa. Now, these people were drafted draft order 75 and 76 right after each other, but they both actually tied for the exact same record in the tourney, which is a win rate of 75% and a number of points of 11, which is really high. That was basically tied for 14th. It says 16 for Fashtusa, but I don't have kind of ties in this, so it has to put him at 16 and him at 14, but they're really both at 14 because they got the same score. And that means that they have a difference between their draft number and their MVP ranking number of like 61 or 60. So these people are basically the most underrated people. Technically speaking, 007 Fashtusa is a little bit more underrated because he was drafted after Saxon, but pretty much it's a tie between these guys. So yeah, congratulations to y'all. You really outperformed your draft. We also see up here Fat Midget, who was drafted 67th, but got 9th in points order. So that's, even higher than Saxon and Fashtusa got, but obviously he was also rated higher, so he's not quite as underrated. Quack Queen drafted 96th by myself, and she got 6 points with a 100% win rate. So that's a difference of 56 because she got 40th in points order, which is a lot higher than 96. Quack Queen really outperformed expectations this tourney. And then we have Sidewalk Hill and Ashley kind of rounding out that top 5, top 6. They got drafted in the late 50s, 60s. Ashley got drafted 59. Sidewalk Hill got drafted 56. And they got in the teens in points order, 13 and 19, with about 10 or 11 points. So yeah, so these are the most underrated players. And so the people who drafted these people should feel good. They are kind of distributed across the teams. Every team got a player who was pretty underrated, it looks like. The team that got the most kind of correctly rated players, you might say, would be Hemi's Little Heilers. Their most underrated player is only 45 points underrated. Yeah, but everyone else kind of got a really underrated player, which is great. So now let's look at something different, which is the most overrated players, the players who were drafted the highest but performed the worst. So if we look at the chart sorted by that, we see, of course, the top Orami. We kind of expected that, right? Orami got drafted 13th, and unfortunately for him, he got 0 points out of 4 games, which is remarkable. And so that's a difference of 60 order points, basically. He got drafted 13th. He got 73rd in points order. Now, the tie for last place is basically a big tie, so I'm not sure exactly what actual order this is. It might not be exactly 73rd, but I think um, regardless of that, I mean, he's the highest drafted person who got 0 points, so yeah, he definitely deserves to be called the most overrated player for this tourney. Now, this could be a fluke, obviously, but yeah, he didn't do so well. Castude is also up here. Castude only had a 25% win rate, got only 4 points, and he was drafted 6th, so he should be performing better than that, right? That means that's a difference of 50 and between draft order and points order. Newt Hitler also went 0 for 4 like Orami, so that's basically the same record, but he was drafted 25th, so that's a little bit less overrated, still pretty overrated. And Mello and Liberalist, very interesting. Both vice captains, right? Both in the first 7 picks. Castude, Mello, and Liberalist, all in the first 7 picks, and they all got a very low amount of points. Mello and Liberalist, Mello only won 1 game. Liberalist only won 2 games for a win rate of 40%. And they both got in the 50s and 49ths in terms of the MVP race. So that's a big difference for Mellow and Liberalist, a big underperformance from them. Yeah. So yeah, these players were all overrated. Yeah, a lot of names on here. Now, this doesn't mean you're bad, obviously. I'm not saying you're bad if you're on this list. I'm just saying your performance in the tourney didn't live up to your draft expectations, which is fine. You know, it's always flukes. I got 1 game out of 3 that I won, so it sucks sometimes. So now let's look at something else that's interesting, which is who are the most correctly rated players. Now, if we look at that, we can actually look at the very kind of middle of this. So these are the people who have a difference of 0 between their draft order and their points order. And there's only 3 people who were drafted perfectly, quote unquote. And these people are Murtix, Oman8, and Lion Lizard. Lion Lizard, first place in the draft, first draft overall, got first in points. Look at that. Perfect draft. Now, this is first in points, not counting Pingu, of course. Pingu's a captain, he doesn't count. Oman8, 93rd in the draft and got 93rd in points. He performed at 0, so that was kind of a expected thing that he would get no points. And Murtix, 35th in the draft and got 35th in points, got 7 points, 50% win rate. So yeah, he performed pretty mediocre, which is about what was expected. Yeah. And yeah, the guys around here are all pretty correctly rated. We see OSRS 69, Omich, Freakin' and Gestapo. Yeah. So these vice captains kind of performed closer to what they were expected, as opposed to the other ones that we saw which were pretty overrated, it turned out. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of kind of solid players in here, and some kind of bad players that were drafted later. So this shows that captains are pretty good at knowing when players are really bad or really not going to perform well. Yeah. So moving on from this, lots of data to look at. So here's a nice little graph that shows points versus draft order. And we can see, okay, there's a lot of zeros out there, including a lot of zeros going even into the high level draft orders, the people who are supposedly pretty good. Arami's up there. We can see the highest level person who got 0. But yeah, this kind of shows a best fit line for the correlation between draft order and points. And we can see there's a pretty good correlation. It's kind of cloudy, but there is kind of a linear order to this that we can see. And I've kind of highlighted some of the biggest outliers. The biggest outliers really are Orami, Fat Midget, Saxjon, 007 Vestusa, and Quack Queen, like we mentioned earlier. Boom, boom, boom. Everyone's kind of, yeah, clustered around this line somewhat, right? Now, we can see this line even more clearly if we compare the points order to the drafts order. This was comparing the points to the drafts order, which is a little bit different. So if we compare those two things, we can see, okay, yeah, it's kind of clearly around this line. This is a little bit less accurate because this kind of doesn't account for ties and points, but we can definitely see how this is correlated in this way as well. So yeah, that's some good stuff on that. And one thing that I wanted to look at is what's the correlation between draft order and points order, like numerically speaking? What's the actual correlation coefficient? And I did the calculation on that, and it turns out the correlation between draft order and points is negative 0.59. And what that tells us is, okay, the higher you got on the draft order, which means the lower your draft order is, the more points you would get with a correlation of about 0.6. Now, correlation can be as high as 1, but that would be perfect correlation. That doesn't exist in real life, right? So 0.6 is pretty high, I would say. Pretty good, especially when you consider the correlation between ELO and points is only 0.45. Which means that basically we can see, numerically speaking, that the captains have a better idea of how good the players are than ELO. Captains can kind of tell when players are inflated and deflated a little bit. We can kind of see that exact difference here between these two numbers. Like, how good are captains? This is how good captains are. They're about 0.15 kind of correlation points better than ELO is. That's pretty good. I would say that's a success for the captains, right? I think captains did well. We can also look at the teams grouped by the average underratedness or overratedness. So this is kind of how we can see which team had the most overrated and underrated players after the draft. And we can see that, if you have a negative score, that means that your players are really underrated, and positive means they were overrated. Hemi's players were pretty underrated. The silent majorities players were pretty underrated, right? 4 Team Not Found were pretty underrated. Pingu's players were about correctly rated. Very close to correctly rated, which is interesting considering, they won. They had pretty correctly rated players. So I guess that kind of tells you that Pingu might have had the best, most accurate eye for the draft. Now, he didn't have that many players who surprised him that much by doing better, but he also didn't have that many players who did worse than expected, we can see. So, and then the players, the teams that had players that were overrated were the Drunk Zoo, the Naughty List, and the Mexicans, which we would expect because these teams kind of filled out the bottom 4. Except for, it's interesting that 404 Team Not Found had a bunch of, on average, their players were underrated, and yet they got last. So, it goes to show, these things are kind of funky, but yeah. The Mexicans definitely had the most, by far, it looks like the most overrated players. Their players were about 12 places on average overrated, which is kind of nuts. That's because they had a lot of players, I think, that got 0 points, more than any other team. So that's a very interesting thing for them. Yeah, so that's kind of cool to look at. Also, it's just some bonus stuff. This is distribution of points on a histogram, so we can see there's a lot of people who got 0 points, but then there's kind of people who got the people who got the rest of the points. It kind of curves out towards the end there. There's a little bit of a spike at the end there. That's the really, really top players. And this is a distribution of ELO, right? So this is showing how the ELO distribution is, and we can see that there's kind of the average is kind of over here at like, what is this, like 1650, 1700? And then there's a few people below that, and then there's kind of a big tail over here. Yeah, so there's a lot of high ELO players, a lot of 1700s, 1800s in the tournament, obviously. Look at that. And then here we see a distribution of the difference. This is the overrated, underratedness metric that I've been using. And we can see, okay, obviously a lot of people are right here at the middle at about 0. And then we kind of see that it looks to me like there's more people who are overrated than underrated, which I think kind of intuitively makes sense, right? We had a lot of people who, it's easy to get 0, right? It's easy to kind of bust her out and get 0. It's not as easy to overperform in this game. Yeah, and we see that most of the points were in fact scored by a very few people, right? So it kind of makes sense that it's hard to overperform that much. Yeah. So that's my video. Wow, 15 minutes of video. Yeah, so this is a lot of cool data about draft analysis, and I hope you liked it. And yeah, I'll see you later.